Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bloomsday Montreal, Festival Bloomsday Montreal on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We're here, a group of us, to show you a film, a video, a launch of Donovan King's virtual walk. This was a production of Bloomsday Montreal, since Donovan is a regular part of our Bloomsday Festival. His walk is one of the popular events, and we just didn't want to not have one this year. So we were able to put it together, get a film crew together to film Donovan, and that's what we're here today to launch this film. We're very pleased that we have with us Donovan King, Sid Zanferlin, the filmmaker, and Kate Bevan Baker, who is the musician whose beautiful fiddle music and the music from her group Boomerang livens up the film. So I wanted to ask Sid a couple of questions, the reason being that Sid, you know, this is COVID-19 and everybody's been confined, and Sid today is going to take his family off for a little trip into the country, and they're leaving at 11. So he won't be here for the question and answer after the film. So I want to ask Sid a couple of questions right now. Is that okay, Sid?
Yeah, of course. Hi.
Cool. Hi. Hi. So first of all, Sid, I wanted to ask you, I mean, I called you up out of the blue. We're colleagues. I'm an actor and Sid is a filmmaker, so we've worked together on a number of documentaries and true crime series and things like that. So Sid, were you familiar with the history of this part of Montreal before you got involved with this project?
I was a little bit. I've had some people send me scripts about this time period in Montreal and how they've been wanting to do a television series about it. And I was fascinated by it. And that was the first time. And that was a couple of years ago. And I'd heard about Donovan through the Gazette and through CBC and the great work that he'd been doing. And I had been meaning to take my family to do one of his tours. So when you called, I didn't realize it was the same tour guide I'd been reading about. And once I put those two things together, I was hooked. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot during this time with Donovan. It was fascinating. It was also frustrating that a lot of people in Montreal don't know about these things. And I'm happy that I was able to be a part of, you know, a little tour that showcases these places that I learned about, and I hope we did it justice.
Well, I've already seen the film, and I say that you did. Now, obviously, some of my ancestors, I'm Irish, arrived on those coffin ships, and they didn't stay here in Montreal. They moved on to Ontario, and my other relatives, ancestors are United Empire Loyalists who came up from the States to settle in the Gananoque area. So all of us, I'm pretty sure, came from somewhere else and were not coming here because everything was rosy back in the old country. Your family is from South America. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got here to Canada?
Yeah, my parents are from Chile, and back in 1970, my dad he was an Allende supporter, which was more left wing. And he knew something was up. Also, he had an uncle here, and he was 20 at the time, and he wanted to start fresh and start somewhere new, away from somewhere that was so politically heavy at the time. And so he came out here, and sure enough, 3 years later, Pinochet, there was a big coup d'etat in Chile. And a lot of Chileans left Chile at that time. And so by 1975, by the time I was 4 years old, I remember my parents having a lot of Chileans that had just come here and made them feel welcome, made them feel part of a community, of a bigger community. And it was good for me at that age to see that, to see and hear the stories of things that were happening back in Chile, and how my parents were trying to be as supportive as they could to all Chileans that came here.
Well, that's very moving. Of course, I know Patricio Enriquez, another filmmaker who's from Chile, who came at the same time. Well, that, it really ties in with the film and how these extraordinarily badly treated people were welcomed in Montreal, or not welcomed, as the case may be. I'm sorry, I intended to introduce Donovan and Kate Bevan-Baker so that our audience can get a look at them, and neglected to do so because I was so focused on Sid, because he's my buddy. But let's, Edmund, if you could let us have a glance at Donovan and Kate. And then we want to see your face too, so that our audience knows who's actually pulling the strings behind the scenes. And if anything goes wrong, you can just tell us, stop everything, or whatever you need to tell us, so that, nothing's hidden behind the scenes. All right, Donovan, let's have a look at you.
Good morning.
There he is, Donovan King, famous gardener. If you go on Facebook, you'll see Donovan posts pictures of his garden every day. He's got a new garden. That's great. So great to see you, Donovan. And now let's have a look at Kate, who's in the country with her family.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, Kate. Wonderful to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're delighted. We're delighted. And Edmund, let's have a look at you.
Oh, good morning, Kathleen. A pleasure to be here.
Great. Okay, so now our audience knows who's behind the scenes and who's in front of the camera, or however you describe it, on stage, off stage, backstage. And I think it's time now to have a look at this film. Thank you.
Great.
Roll it.
My name is Donovan King, and I work with a company called Irish Montreal Excursions. Today I'm going to be giving a virtual walking tour on behalf of the Bloomsday 2020 Festival about the Irish Famine's impact in Montreal in 1847. But before getting into it, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging that today's tour will be taking place on the unceded Mohawk territory of Tiohtià:ke. Now, it's important to note that about 10,000 years ago, this area was underwater. As the waters receded and the river valley formed, islands began to pop out. And this is where the ancestors of the Mohawk people settled. They had a major trade center here on the island called Hodsiragan. The French call it Hochelaga. And for many, many thousands of years, this was a very bustling place as other First Nations came in from all over the place to trade. Now, at the beginning of the 1600s, Europeans began colonizing these lands. In particular, the French began colonizing first out east at places like Tadoussac, Port-Royal, Quebec City, and Trois-Rivières. And then in 1642, an organization called the Notre Dame Society for the Conversion of the Savage Peoples of New France, I kid you not, it was actually called that, decided to set up a religious colony here on the island of Tiohtià:ke. The colony was called Ville-Marie, and we can see here today, Pointe-à-Calière Museum is on the exact same site as that original colony. Now, it's interesting to note that there was actually Irish people in New France. A lot of people don't realize this. But what happened was when Oliver Cromwell invaded Ireland in the early 1600s, he gave the Irish soldiers an option. He said you could either stay in Ireland under the penal laws and become second-class citizens, or you can go fight for a Catholic king in another country. And so many of them went to France and Spain, and those who went to France, some of them inevitably settled here in the colonies of what they called New France. And so that was about 5% of the population of New France. And through other history throughout the years, which I'll be talking about on the tour today, it means that about 40% of Quebecers actually have Irish blood. And so the story we're looking at today is a horrible story resulting from British colonization, but it does have a silver lining in that those Irish who did survive the famine went on to become citizens of this land, often as some of the best artists, politicians, teachers, and so forth. And so we're going to begin the tour down here by the waterfront, here in the old port. And so if you just follow me this way, please. This is Montreal's harbor, the old harbor at least, and this is really where the story begins in 1847 on the 5th of June when a ship arrived here, a steamer from Quebec City with a girl who was quite ill. The doctors diagnosed it as sunstroke. And just 2 days later, 3 more steamers arrived, disgorging 2,304 Irish refugees here on these wharves in the Calcutta-like heat. Many of them began dropping like flies. Many of them died, and many of them were buried randomly along the banks of the canal and here along the harbor. Now, to give you some backstory, what had happened in Ireland following these penal laws that were implemented is the Irish citizens became very much second class. They weren't allowed to own land, for example. And so they had to pay these Anglo-Protestant landlords to live on their land, and they would basically grow crops for the landlords and potatoes for themselves, which were quite nutritious. Now the problem was a potato blight struck Ireland in the 1840s, and it got progressively worse and worse. And soon people began starving because when they tried to harvest the tubers, they pulled up inedible mush. Now instead of supporting them, the landlords would often sort of send them away, evict them, and put them on what were known as coffin ships to send them to the 4 corners of the planet. And a coffin ship was essentially a Canadian lumber ship that would normally bring lumber to Liverpool, dump it, take on a ballast, and then return here to get more lumber. Now in this case, the ballast was human beings. The Irish were crammed below the decks in filthy conditions. There wasn't enough water for washing, only for drinking. The food wasn't nutritious enough. And if you wanted to use the toilet, you had to use a bucket. And so this created filthy conditions, which were the perfect breeding ground for a disease known as ship's fever or typhus. Now this is caused by a bacteria, the Rickettii bacteria, which is spread through insects, things like lice, mites, spiders. And if an insect were to bite you and were you to scratch the wound, it would circulate for about 10 to 12 days, and then there would be an awful lot of horrible symptoms. Needless to say, in about 30% of cases, the people would die, and on those coffin ships, they were simply tossed overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. When they arrived in the river, they were quarantined on an island called Grosse Ile near Quebec City, where there were doctors and a hospital. There's about 5,000 Irish buried there today. It's a National Historic Site that can be visited. But Grosse Ile was unable to stop the spread of the typhus, and so the ships continued moving upriver, and as I mentioned, on the 5th of June, the first one arrived here. It was the beginning of a very long and difficult summer as thousands and thousands of more refugees arrived every single week. By the end of the summer, over 75,000 refugees had landed here in Montreal Harbor for a city of only 50,000 people. So that would be like 6 million refugees arriving in Montreal today. So yes, this is where it all started. And we're going to continue moving along now to the Grey Nuns' mother house so I can explain their role in this tragedy. And this here is the old Grey Nuns' mother house. This building played a very significant role during the Irish Famine of 1847. Now, essentially, the Grey Nuns was an order set up by a lady named Marguerite Duville during the New France era. She would go on to become Canada's first female saint. But in 1847, the Mother Superior, her name was Mother McMullen, and about a week after the first ships arrived, she began hearing rumors about a humanitarian disaster unfolding in the fever sheds and went over there to check for herself what exactly was going on. When she arrived at the sheds, she was horrified. The stench was overwhelming. She found the living and the dead cohabitating the same space. Babies were suckling on the teats of dead mothers. There were corpses lying all over the place. And so she immediately returned here to the mother house. And during the recreation hour, she assembled the sisters and she told them, and I quote, "The plague is contagious. In sending you there, I am signing your death warrant. You're free to accept or refuse." Now, these being sisters, not a single one of them refused, having taken their vows, and they immediately went down to the sheds to begin the gruesome task of separating the living from the dead. Now, of course, because typhus is contagious, it wasn't long before the sisters here began to contract it, began to fall ill, and they were replaced by the Sisters of Providence, and then they were replaced by the Sisters of the Hôtel Dieu. Now, eventually, as the summer wore on, a lot of the nuns and other religious members began dying, of course, from the typhus. But luckily, we did have a great mayor by the name of John Easton Mills, who really tried to hold everything together. And so if it wasn't for these heroes, it would have been a lot worse for those famine refugees. And so we're going to continue along now to the Lachine Canal and move up there to the site of those first fever sheds. Now, just over here we have the first famine cemetery from 1847, according to the research that was done. The fever sheds were located just over here behind you, and the burial ground was located in this area over here. Now, as I mentioned, there was only 2 fever sheds left from an epidemic of 1832, which was totally insufficient. So when the nuns arrived, they found a humanitarian disaster. Now, luckily, the mayor, John Easton Mills, sprang into action. He took charge of the site. He was seen here with his saw, his carpentry tools, building more fever sheds with his team of workers. He was also known at the hour of midnight to come here to personally care for the refugees by giving them water, listening to them, giving them hope. And so he was a very heroic mayor in the eyes of Montreal's Irish community. Now, I should probably mention that by the month of July, the Irish had begun to spread throughout Montreal, bringing with them the typhus. Montrealers themselves started to contract the disease and to die, and many people became very angry and demanded to know why had the mayor allowed these people into the city. They assembled on the Champ de Mars parade ground one evening, and they actually threatened to come here to the site of the sheds and to pick up these sheds and all of the refugees and to throw them into the St. Lawrence River. Now, luckily, the mayor tried to calm them down. He posted guards on every single bridge and lock here along the canal. He also ordered the steamers to go directly to a place called Windmill Point, about 1 kilometer south of here, and he moved all of the sheds down to Windmill Point, and he also doubled them. That's where we're going to end the tour today, at the Black Rock. But here at this site, which was eventually abandoned, we can see that today there's no commemoration whatsoever, despite the fact that so many important things happened here. For example, the Mohawk First Nation delivered a gift of 170 pounds in famine relief, even though they themselves were impoverished by the same British colonization. It was also here where orphans were collected, and Bishop Ignace Bourget would have those Irish orphans adopted into French families because they were all Catholic, and that is one of the many reasons why about 40% of Quebecers have Irish blood in them today. And finally, John Easton Mills, the mayor himself, I should probably mention, who was here at the site caring for those refugees, ended up contracting the typhus himself and dying in the month of November 1847, earning him the moniker Montreal's Martyr Mayor. And so despite the fact that this incredible history, this incredible compassion unfolded right here, where we now have a bicycle path, you know, it's really sad that there's no commemoration, especially because this is a burial ground. In 1876, as they were digging the Wellington Basin, we can see the lip of the basin right over here. So this extended inwards like this. They began pulling up skeletons, all sorts of skeletons. And at first they would just throw them in the garbage until a politician named Bernard Devlin intervened and instructed them, no, they must be buried in the Catholic cemetery on Mount Royal. But that means that anything on that side of the lip, which was the basin, would have been emptied, but anything on this side still has bodies under the ground. So there's literally bodies under my feet right now. And again, this is one more problem of Irish commemoration, or a lack of it here in the city. And that's something we're really trying to push the mayor to do, is to mark all of these sites in an appropriate manner. Now this is the Lachine Canal. Now it's important to note that most of the Famine Irish wanted to continue moving westward. A lot of them wanted to move into the United States away from British colonization, but the problem is Montreal Island is really at the end of the road for any ships because it's surrounded by rapids. And so in 1821, the Lachine Canal was dug, largely by the Irish, I might add. And so the famine refugees really had to go 13 kilometers along this canal so they could continue moving westward. Now the problem was there was a major shortage of canal boats, and so there weren't enough boats to move these people, so a lot of them just struck out on foot to walk along the tow line, and of course many of them dropped like flies and were buried here along the banks of the canal as well. Now it's also important to note that about 50% of these refugees could not afford to move westward, and so they really had no choice but to move here into the Griff, or Griffintown, which today is, of course, a condo-choked neighborhood. But it has a really interesting history. You see, this land was eventually purchased by a man named Thomas McCord from the Nuns. And while he was away on a business trip in 1791 to the United Kingdom, one of his unscrupulous business associates actually sold his land behind his back to a certain Mrs. Mary Griffin, the wife of a soap factory owner. And Mrs. Griffin set about hiring an urban planner to lay out streets, lots that she could sell to build houses on. And when Thomas McCord returned, he found that there was a small community called Griffintown sitting on his land. He was furious. He tried to erase the name from streets and parks. He went to court, and while he did win his land back in court, the name Griffintown has stuck with us to this very day. Now, I should probably mention that when those refugees poured in there, this transformed into Canada's most notorious shanty town for well over a century, with all of the impoverished, famine refugees pouring in there. So we're talking about ramshackle construction, no running water, people using privies. This created a breeding ground for all sorts of disease, typhus, typhoid, Spanish flu, smallpox. This would decimate the population again and again and again, not to mention all of the industrial accidents, floods, fires, murders, and far worse. You see, in the 1960s, the mayor, Jean Drapeau, decided to rezone the entire Griff as an industrial zone because he considered it an eyesore. He essentially drove this bridge, the Bonaventure Expressway, right through the neighborhood, and with his rezoning, it went from a height of 70,000 people to less than 1,000 in just the span of a few short years. Recently it's been rezoned again. This time it's the condominium crowd moving in, which is kind of unfortunate actually. Now, one of the problems that's been occurring here in the Griff is a commemoration problem. A lot of the Irish community have complained that our heritage hasn't been respected here. And the most obvious example that came up recently is this new train line that we're seeing here. It's called the REM, the Réseau Électrique de Montréal. And this train line they're going to be building a station right here in Griffintown, and so one would assume it would be called Griffintown Station, but unfortunately in November the mayor decided that she wanted it named Griffintown Bernard Laundrie, after a politician. This did not go down very well with the Irish community, and many of us suggested that perhaps it would be better to rename the multimedia city after Mr. Laundrie, because that's actually what he built over there. Now these are the ruins of St. Anne's Church here in Griffintown. Now, because so many famine refugees poured here into the neighborhood when it was a shanty town, it was decided to erect a Catholic church in 1854 because, of course, most of these refugees were Catholic. Now, if you look behind me where these benches are is where the pews used to be. And as you've probably noticed, I'm surrounded by the ruins of St. Anne's Church. And that's because it was unceremoniously demolished in 1970 after Jean Drapeau rezoned this neighborhood as an industrial zone. There simply weren't enough people to justify having a congregation anymore, which is unfortunate because you have to imagine how many weddings occurred here, how many communions, the confession of the many, many sins, and of course, we mustn't forget the funerals either. Now, when someone died here in Griffintown, their body was usually collected by Ferron's funeral home. The corpse was embalmed and then shipped back here in a coffin, when it often had to be dragged up a narrow flight of stairs or even pulled through a window on a rope due to the ramshackle construction. But once it was inside, the coffin was propped in the upright position. They would put 3 candles around the feet and then decorate the front entrance of the home with black crepe paper to inform the other neighbors and residents that there was a 3-day wake in progress. And a 3-day wake was a party of sorts between the living and the dead. It wasn't only for reminiscing the dead, but it also involved copious amounts of drinking alcohol, singing, dancing, storytelling, and whatnot. And as I'm sure you can imagine, with a 3-day party of this sort, you know, things sometimes got a little out of hand. For example, sometimes they would take the corpse out of the coffin to take it for a last dance around the room before the burial. There was also a rather twisted prank they like to play here in the Griff. The Irish do have a good sense of humor. The famine survivors, that humor was darkened very much, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now, here was the prank. Sometimes a guest would fall asleep at one of these parties after drinking too much. And so what they would do is they would remove the corpse from the coffin, put the slumbering guest into the coffin, and then using black boot polish, paint the skin all black, which was of course the final symptom of typhus before death. And so when the person woke up, they would think that they had contracted the typhus and had died. One man actually had to be taken away in an ambulance. But today the park is merely used by dog walkers and people doing yoga. All of these new residents are enjoying it in their own way, which is unfortunate because the ruins of St. Anne's Church are perhaps the best reminder of the old days when this was Canada's most notorious shanty town. Now this is the site of Montreal's second famine cemetery right here at the Black Rock. There's actually approximately 6,000 Irish famine victims buried just here under my feet. In 1847, when the mayor John Easton Mills decided to move the site of the fever sheds, he had 22 more sheds erected directly behind you over here. Now the area where I'm standing now was of course used as the cemetery. Now approximately a decade later, they decided to start building the Victoria Bridge, which was the first bridge to span the St. Lawrence River, and the workers actually repurposed those fever sheds as housing. And as the bridge was nearing completion in 1859, the workers accidentally unearthed some of the victims here from the cemetery. They stopped all work and they said, we're not going to finish this bridge until the cemetery is properly commemorated. And so a team dredged up this 5-ton granite boulder from the bottom of the St. Lawrence River and affixed it here on this pedestal and engraved these words here into the stone, which were essentially to preserve from desecration the remains of the 6,000 victims buried in the vicinity. Now, unfortunately, this site has been desecrated again and again and again throughout history. As you can see right now, we're in the middle of an industrial zone. So I'll just give you a few examples of what happened over the years. First of all, they refused to cede this land to the Catholic Church. It was given to the Anglican Church because it was a British company, which meant that the Irish had no control over their own cemetery. The Anglicans allowed it to become overgrown with weeds and whatnot. The Redemptorist priests began marching here, and then the Ancient Order of Hibernians in the late 1800s, so they could properly commemorate the stone. Now, in the early 1900s, the Grand Trunk Railway purchased the site and decided the stone had to go so they could lay down more railroad tracks. In the dead of night, the stone was removed from the site and brought down on a rail car to St. Patrick's Square where it was installed. The Irish community was outraged. It took a full 10 years to return it here to the site after petitioning the railway commissioners in Ottawa. There's more. In the 1940s, as they were digging, they pulled up all sorts of bodies as they were digging a construction tunnel. This did prove that there was a cemetery, something the Grand Trunk tried to deny. Then for Expo 67, the city wanted to remove the rock so they could build this highway. The Irish community refused, and so they agreed upon a split solution, which means there's now highways running on either side of the rock, and it's in the middle of a traffic island. And perhaps the worst one of all happened just last year. The REM Railway decided that they needed to plant a concrete pylon for their monorail right into the heart of the cemetery, digging up 14 of our ancestors and sending them to a laboratory where they are right now. I'm a member of a group called the Irish Monument Park Foundation, and we worked on the file. We wrote academic papers, held conferences, did exhibitions, lobbied people, did research and so forth. And we thought we were getting somewhere, but then suddenly Hydro-Quebec bought all of this land all of a sudden because they need to build a new electrical substation to power the REM and all the new condos in Griffintown. We thought we'd lost the battle, but thank God for us, Hydro-Quebec actually has a lot of experience from flooding Indigenous burial grounds and whatnot, with their teams of archaeologists, public relations crews and so forth. And so they met with our community, and we actually got them to agree to cede a large parcel of this land to create the world-class park that we actually want. And so it does appear that it's going to happen. Since then, there's been a lot of talk at City Hall about even moving Bridge Street off of the cemetery. And so these are things that we're hoping are going to happen in the near future. And so basically, this concludes our tour today at the Black Rock. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a few things about the Irish famine's impact here in Montreal. And last but not least, I also wanted to give a plug to the Ancient Order of Hibernians, who does a Walk to the Stone the last Sunday of every May to commemorate our dear ancestors. This year, only 2 of the members went. My friends Fergus Keys and Victor Boyle, to install the wreath. Because of the COVID, they had to cancel it. But hopefully next year it will be back on schedule, and I invite you to join us then.
Hello. Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Donovan. Really a film that we can be proud of. You condensed a huge amount of history in a very, very short time. And I want to congratulate Sid. I see you're still with us. Really terrific. Can I just ask Sid one more question before I get to you, Donovan? And please, any of you attending, and if you have any questions, send them on the Q&A. I think you have a Q&A function on your screen, because that's what we're here for, answer more questions. Sid, can you talk about the filming, if there was anything interesting or unusual about the process of actually filming this?
The cinematographer Hong Nguyen and I tried a couple of things. Donovan, I'm sure you remember when we first met, we tried to get 4 or 5 different ways of presenting what Donovan does and does so well. And we realized that the thing that we wanted to do really would have been like a 360 virtual reality tour. And because of that, we realized that geographically, we should be always moving to show where Donovan is at all times, so that the audience at home can get a sense of it without having VR glasses, but can, in essence, go around. I mean, Donovan's a very good-looking guy, and we could have done it all in close-up, but it wasn't about that. It was about the places that he was talking about. And so we decided to keep them pretty wide and always move and go around, so we know what he's talking about. And the cinematographer Hong was very good at trying to show geographically what he's, in the background. At the same time that he was bringing something up, he would try to show that by moving to it. And I think he did it successfully, to the point that I didn't have to cut that much. I didn't have to get that much B-roll. There was times where it was absolutely needed, but it was easy. Donovan is a pro. He knows what he's doing. He's really good at what he does. We never had to do it more than twice. It took all day, not because of the filming process, but because the places are pretty far and we had equipment, we had to walk around. But because in the last 3 months, none of us have worked, we welcomed it. We welcomed lugging and walking around. And at first we were like, oh, geez, a lot of walking. But hey, we haven't done this in 3 months. This is actually kind of great. Yeah. So I think that was our focus, was to really show the geography, let Donovan do his thing without cutting too much. At times we did little intros where it was super wide and Donovan would walk into the shot, and we were conscious that he was only going to do the first 2 lines that way to really show, say, the pews at St. Anne's Church. We did that super wide so that we would get what he's talking about. But he only did the first 2 lines, and then we would go in and do the rest of it just by always moving and capturing what he does and does so well.
Okay, great. Well, that's great. Certainly, it was moving all the time. It recreated a walking tour because you're always on the move. And the whole thing is about movement and immigration and not knowing where you're going and all of that stuff. So it's just perfect for that. You did it in, well, you filmed eight hours, and then you edited in lickety split time, can I say. It was very, very quick.
It was easy to edit.
Yeah.
And lastly, I want to say that there were moments of segues from moment to moment that I felt needed some music, and we put some temp music in there. And thanks to Donovan to point out, you know what, we really need Irish music. Of course we do. And then Kate came in and did and gave us some wonderful music that I think really highlights the tour, highlights it in a way where at times there should be, some energy to it. But then there's another piece, I think it's called A Song of Books, which is a little bit more somber. And I tried to be true to what Donovan was talking about, to use the different moods of Kate's wonderful music. How'd we do with your music?
There we go. Okay.
I hope you paid it justice.
Yes, it was very great. Thank you. Having not really seen the video before and just getting a request for some Irish music, I decided to just send you lots of options. But I think you chose really well music that highlighted the mood and the setting of the tour, and the little snippets never felt too short and random. They fit in perfectly. So bravo.
Donovan, did you want to say anything about the filming process? How it went for you?
Sure. You know, basically, I thought it was a great day. I mean, as you mentioned, none of us have worked in a long time, and I do, you know, while I am a tour guide and really enjoy doing it live, I'm often on camera for the media and whatnot, so I'm used to that process. And I thought you guys were super professional. You did an amazing job, and Kate, I must say, your music was just the perfect fit, and I wanted to thank you for that. It was amazing.
It's a pleasure.
Product.
Thanks.
Thank you all to the audience. We have scores of people who are sending questions. The first one is from John Archer. His question is, where was Goose Village exactly, please? Donovan, perhaps you can help us with that one.
Yeah, Goose Village was at the exact same location as the Black Rock. So in a nutshell, Goose Village actually grew out of those fever sheds, which were then converted into housing for the workers. And so eventually a small community formed around there. And, you know, this was also demolished by the mayor, Jean Drapeau, which is why it's an industrial site today.
Oh, that's wonderful. And to see the changes that have gone on over the years. I'm just looking at the questions again. There are a bunch of questions as well as kudos. So thank you from Susan Loftus says, thank you from the bottom of my heart for this poignant video. It's very well done. He's also asking, another person is asking, is there a map available to follow the tour so as to give this geographic perspective with the downtown core?
Yes, I do. I did write a blog about this tour and other issues of Irish commemoration. And so if the person just wants to send me an email or something like that, I can link up the blog, or maybe I can link it up through Bloomsday. But yeah, I do have the map of it. And, you know, some of our proposals to the city, for example, we're hoping to get a commemoration when the Mohawk First Nation came to the aid of our ancestors. In Ireland, they have a beautiful sculpture called Kindred Spirits about when the Choctaw First Nation gave famine relief. And so this is a great way to make the story known. And so there's a lot of proposals like that in the blog as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from Laureen Bennett. On what street is the original Grey Nuns' convent that Donovan talked about, that you talked about in the video? She says, yeah, great video, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It's called St. Pierre Street. And so basically it's parallel with McGill Avenue down in the old port. And so it's just one street over to the east. And so it's pretty much just slightly south of where we had the old Parliament buildings that we burnt down in 1849.
Mm. And then another question here. What are the chances now of preserving all of this amazing history, which a lot of people aren't aware of? And has the present municipal administration been more or less involved and sympathetic to preserving this history?
That's a great question. There's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of lobbying that we've been doing with City Hall, and in general, they pay some lip service. In other cases, for example, at the Black Rock, they are actually working on the project. In other cases, they're thwarting commemoration. For example, they just renamed one of our streets in the Griff, Basin Street. They renamed it Rue des Bassins. Because apparently some people had a hard time pronouncing Basin. And so, you know, the other example is trying to co-brand Griffintown with a politician who had nothing to do with the Irish or nothing to do with the neighborhood. And so, you know, there's a bit of a mix, but it is very frustrating. It takes a long time to get anything done. But I think the more we continue to push and the more people lobby the government, the more likely it is we will be able to preserve some of this heritage. And that's why I'm working with the Mohawk community to try to get their take on it. You know, I'm working with the Irish community, and of course with all of the various politicians at City Hall, both in the government and the opposition.
And thank you, Donovan. I'm just, as I was watching it and hearing the music as it came up, you know, music is such an important part of setting the I don't know, the feel or the mood of the film, and I thought that worked so well. I wonder if Kate can share a little bit about the background of the music that was put in after the film was made.
Sure. So the music that was used is for a CD that I've just finished recording with a trio called Boomerang. And we were going to launch the CD now or next month, this summer, and do a big live launch and a tour, an East Coast tour, but obviously we can't do that anymore. So we're still in the production process, finishing up the album artwork, and so it doesn't exist physically yet, but I was able to share the digital music files for the film. So I'm happy that some people are getting to hear this music now before the rest of the world can. But it's mostly traditional Irish music that we play. The trio is called Boomerang, the Irish spelling of the word. So it's not super obvious as to how to pronounce it, but we were using instruments that are very typical and common in Irish traditional music. So flute, harp, and fiddle. And we play a lot of old music as well as some new compositions that we write and arrange ourselves. So we're trying to breathe new life into music that's hundreds and hundreds of years old. So yeah, that's the background behind the music that was used.
It sounds wonderful. So it's great that there'll be a CD out, and this video, of course, will be preserved for posterity. So we'll also put in the notes, because this video will be online on YouTube as well. So we put the notes in. We did have a few technical snags, as you probably noticed. At least the video was there in its full glory, but we will have the Kathleen is back. Wonderful. I'm just saying, Kathleen, before we end, that the video will be, we put the full video there, as well as contact information and information about Kate, Donovan, and Sid, of course. So welcome back, Kathleen. If you would turn on your video, there you are.
All right. You know, as you said, we should have an Ethernet connection, and something happened. Maybe a big truck went by my house, and boom, everything disappeared. And then my connection, oh, never mind. Anyway, great to be back. Great to be back. Thank you. So, of course, we've got some questions. Were you able to ask any of the questions, Sid?
Actually, yes. I asked most of the questions on the list, Kathleen. So if you had any notes that you wanted to go through afterwards, that would probably be good.
So we got the answer to where Goose Village is and stuff like that?
We did indeed.
Oh, cool. Well, I'll have to review it. Okay, so I wanted to ask Donovan, and maybe it's already been asked, how long have you been doing these tours, and how on earth did you get into it?
Well, I trained as an actor and a teacher, and so it all started by doing field trips as a teacher, and then I got hired to do ghost tours in Old Montreal. And then one day I was in the Notre Dame Basilica with my history students, and this lady came up to us with her tour group and waved a permit at me and said, "Monsieur, il faut avoir un permis pour faire les visites guidées," which means you have to have a permit to do a guided visit. And I said, "Madame, you know, I'm a history teacher trained at McGill University. These are my students." And so I later went online and found that legally it's true that you need this permit in Montreal due to a bylaw called G2. And so I did the course. You have to do a course at the ATHQ for about 8 months. It costs over $2,000 to permit. And so I just wanted to get it to see like what's going on behind the scenes here. And, you know, I found out that it's all this horrible like monopoly of tour guides, you know, based on the 60s, 98% white, and some of them still calling First Nations people savages to tourists, you know, and pointing at the racist statues. And so, you know, since I saw that, I started re-gearing my tour companies towards more activism, you know, post-colonial tours that delve into things like Indigenous history that's often neglected in the regular tourism industry here. So I guess I've been doing these tours for probably about, my guess would be about 25 years, something like that.
Wow, okay. And I know you're very interested in in having Indigenous people do tours, and you're trying to overturn that bylaw. So that's, let's not get into the politics, but I'm sure you've got some information about that on your blog. I have a question here. How do we access your blog, Donovan?
It's called the OTL blog, and so it's otl.com, I believe, and then you just click on the blog. I'll just double check that. I don't even know my own web address, you know.
So OTL stands for?
Optative Theatrical Laboratories, and that's an experimental company that's very much at the root of all of my work.
Oh.
That was formed at the turn of the millennium at the University of Calgary with my Indigenous friend, Peter Peltier. And so, sorry, the blog is optative.net/blog.
Optative.net/blog. Great.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. I'm like so technically ill-informed. I don't know how to do any of this stuff, but we'll see whether we can put that up on the Bloomsday Montreal website so that people will be able to access it more directly, or at least have the information. Let's see. Another question is, how were the Irish involved in the construction of the Victoria Bridge?
Good question. Now, essentially what had happened was the survivors of the famine obviously needed work. And so when they began building the Victoria Bridge, this was a British company, a lot of the laborers were Irish. The Irish were renowned navvies, or navigational workers, doing canals, railways, bridges, embankments, things like that. And so it was kind of bizarre in that some of these people who had perhaps survived the famine in one of the sheds was there working in the same shed 12 years later building the bridge. And so this is one of the reasons why they stopped work on the bridge when they discovered the bodies, is that so many of the workers were Irish. They said, no, we can't allow the desecration of our family members. These are brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, children, all buried randomly with no tombstones, no records, nothing like that. And so it was very much the Irish who were kind of the workers on the project, if not the managers or the entrepreneurs.
Mm. Well, that's very interesting. There's another question here about records. Are there any records of the people who arrived in the boats?
Some of the records exist at Grosse Ile because, of course, they had a hospital there and the doctors were trying to manage things in a proper manner. So yes, if you go there, you can see, for example, they put up a memorial of the names of the people that they have in the records. Whereas, unfortunately, in Montreal, it was just such a humanitarian disaster. There was no time to keep any records. And so, like, it's really sad to think that all of these people are buried there. And we don't know their names, we don't know really much information about them because there were no records at the time.
Right, so the people were, I mean, it's not like they bought tickets or there was a ship's manifest with the names of the passengers. I would assume they just crammed into the holds, and those who made it dispersed in the country once they got here if they didn't die. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, a lot of them stayed in the Griff and the others would disperse often westwards.
So there'd be parish records from various places, but other than that, yeah. Okay, and then there's another question. Couldn't the federal government intervene and say, have these sites be declared heritage areas or zones or monuments?
Well, they've already tried on they've already tried on 3 separate occasions to get the Historical Monuments Board on board, and in all 3 cases they rejected it as a National Historic Site at the Black Rock, and they said it was because it was related to a disaster, and apparently they didn't commemorate those things the last time the application was made, which I find a bit weird because a disaster is still part of history, right? We've got shipwrecks, we've got all sorts of histories of disaster, and that's something that's interesting to know about and to commemorate as well. Like a plane crash, for example. They do have a small monument about one of these plane crashes that happened, I believe, in the 90s, you know? So, you know, there's nothing wrong with commemorating a disaster, in my opinion. In fact, I think it should be commemorated.
Well, nobody would remember the Titanic if it hadn't had that unfortunate encounter with the iceberg.
Exactly. And if you go to Belfast today, there's this whole Titanic Museum they've built right on the waterfront. And so like, tourists actually are interested in this. You know, if you go to Germany, the first place they say is visit these old concentration camps. They're horrible. You have to see with your own eyes what happened, you know, and again, that was a terrible disaster. And so, you know, I think the government needs to review its policies, but at the same time, Justin Trudeau has sent us a letter offering his support, you know, but, you know, we need to convert support into action. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen.
Right. So, of course, I was away for 5-7 minutes. I don't know whether Kate was able to speak and talk about her her career. That was the question that my computer didn't want me to know the answer to, I think. So I was asking about how the bandmates got together, and then I wanted to say, what styles of music do you play? Is it only Irish or?
Right. Sure. So this trio has been together since 2015. It's been 5 years now. And it's Sarah Page on harp, David Gossage plays flutes and whistles, and myself on fiddle. And Sarah and I also sing together on some of the tracks on the CD that will be out soon. But we came together 5 years ago. Sarah and I played in the National Youth Orchestra of Canada way back in the day, 15 years ago, when we were both young classical musicians. So the National Youth Orchestra takes young musicians from all across the country, and you spend 4 weeks in one city learning repertoire, and then you tour the country playing concerts. So that's how we first met. And then 10 years later, we crossed paths again. And now we're not playing classical music anymore. We're playing mostly Irish stuff, which is really fun. And I've been playing Irish music with Dave Gossage in pubs for 8 or 9 years now. So I moved to Montreal from Prince Edward Island 10 years ago and met Dave shortly after. And he had known Sarah from playing some African music, and they were involved in some indie projects. So the three of us got together, and it was so much fun to play immediately. We all clicked and we get along, and our musical ideas jived really nicely. So we've recorded a EP, a 7-track EP 3 years ago, and we've done some touring around Canada, but we're all really busy with other musical projects, so it's hard to devote all of our energy to this one project. So it's always on the back burner, and this CD will be really exciting once we get it out there.
Well, that's great. How is it going to be available to the public?
It will be launched physically I think you were away. I might have talked about this already. Sorry. It's okay. It'll be launched hopefully in the next 3 or 4 months.
So will people be able to access it on iTunes or?
Yeah, we'll do a full launch, and you can hear our other recorded music on our website, which is boomerangmusic.com. And maybe I could type that out, or you could share it somehow.
Boomerangmusic.com. It's with a U instead of a double O, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's really great. So let's see. Somebody's talking about their own personal history, and oh my goodness, this is so interesting. This is fantastic. This is from Nicole. This is fantastic. Sad, but so great to learn our history. My grandmother Marjorie Connors founded the Patricia House. My father wanted to give her money to help her cause, and she wouldn't take it. So he hid it in the house, and she would find it and thank God for the gift. Isn't that lovely? And somebody, Marlene asks, could we talk a little bit more about the cinematographer? Sid, I know you're going to dash away, but.
Yeah, Hong Nguyen, dear friend of mine. We've been working together for about, 8 years now. We now have short form of communicating. And he really is a great cameraman. He's got a great eye. And I don't even know anymore after all these years working together where whose idea is whose. We just collaborate so well. It's like, why don't we do that? Oh, I was thinking the same thing. And then I think Donovan will attest to that, is that we never have to discuss anything more than 20 seconds. We both know what we're thinking and we just go with it. Very intuitive cinematographer. And I've done, short films with him. I hope to do my first feature with him. Kathleen, I believe you've worked with him too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very respectful and great. Hong Nguyen, you can look him up. He's done a couple of feature documentaries, lots of TV. He recently went to South Korea to do some music videos. He's working hard.
Oh, that's great. That's super. Let's see. So we had another question about Gros Seal. Did all the boats that came here have to stop at Gros Seal?
Yes, they did, theoretically, and at some points there was literally a line of ships over 1 kilometer long waiting to disembark on the island. And you can imagine the horrors of this. And so some of those did slip by in the night, according to the oral history that I've heard. And so this is perhaps one of the reasons it was unable to stop the typhus. But I think the other reason is that with a 10 to 12 day incubation period, it's really hard to stop something like this, even with a quarantine station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would have to stop the ships for a month or so.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any more questions, and I think we've at least I've exhausted my questions. Oh yeah, wait a minute. Oh, this is an interesting one. How were the Irish leaders involved with the Patriotes in the 1837 rebellion? I don't know whether we want to get into that, but yeah, the Patriotes, c'était pas juste des Québécois là.
Yeah, the Patriots certainly included Irish people, including the editors of a newspaper called The Vindicator. One of them died, unfortunately, of what was it called? Cholera during the epidemic of 1832, but the other one would go on to fight with Les Patriotes, and his newspaper got shut down, and eventually he went down and became I believe the state secretary of Vermont. This was, I think his name was Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan or something like that. So yeah, the Irish were certainly involved with Les Patriotes, us being rebellious against British colonization throughout our history. So that's not surprising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there was a lot of anyway. That's the history. People can take a history course if they want it. That's just so great. So what I wanted to do now is thank everybody for coming to this on Sunday morning, to Sid and to Kate for putting their family lives on hold for an hour as they joined us, and to Donovan, of course, for all of your work over the years and for putting this film together. I just want to say, and obviously to Edmund for keeping us going. I just want to say that we at Bloomsday Montreal are really, really pleased to have produced this film with you and for you, and it is now yours. With the proviso that we can always have a link to it on our Bloomsday Montreal website. So Donovan, thank you for making the film, and it is now your film, and you are free to use it to promote yourself, to continue to inform and entertain people about what some of the history is of this wonderful city that we live in. Thank you very much to everybody for being here with us, and I hope that you'll come back this afternoon at 2 p.m. Colleen Curran, one of Canada's most entertaining, fun playwrights, certainly one of Montreal's stars in the playwriting field in terms of being just an altogether fabulous, entertaining gal. She's going to be here at 2 p.m. to read from her new play, The Sunset Gals, and a couple of other pieces. So that's going to be really entertaining. That event is sponsored by Playwrights Guild of Canada. So we'll see you at 2. Thank you.